Good morning, everyone. I know there are still people out in the lobby getting their snacks and coffee and making their way into the ballroom, but we have a very full day planned for you all. So we're going to go ahead and get started on time and welcome you to the 7th Annual Bridges to Resilience Conference. My name is Barb Finch. I work for the Department of Social Services here in Santa Barbara County, and I lead the Kids Network, one of the co-creators and organizers of this event. And I am so honored to welcome you here on behalf of our Tri-County partners in Ventura and San Luis Obispo. We've been working really hard to make this a fabulous day for you, and we hope that whatever you came here to receive is what you will leave with at the end of the day. As we begin this day together, I'm going to switch the slides because that's my job. Okay. As we begin this day together, we pause to appreciate the beauty of the land and the ocean that surrounds us. These are the ancestral homelands of the Chumash nations, stewards of this land since time immemorial, who were forcibly displaced and enslaved by European invaders. Today, we seek to better understand the long history that brought us to reside here, to appreciate our place in that history, and to see opportunities for co-creating a more hopeful future. With this, we honor the strength, resilience, and sovereignty of the Chumash peoples, past, present, and future. We are deeply grateful for their ongoing stewardship of the lands and waters of the Central Coast, and for their generous contributions to community well-being here in the Tri-Counties. Bridges to Resilience has been a journey. It started in 2016. And it's always been about increasing awareness about childhood adversity and the ways that our biology affects our health and well-being. We're wanting to not just talk about adversity, but also introduce some hopeful strategies that can help buffer people from toxic stress and boost resilience. The conference was created out of a desire to help people connect across sectors, across disciplines, across organizations. But we know that the magic happens when people connect heart to heart, one to one. So we hope that during the day you will meet people that you didn't know before and become inspired and engaged and invigorated to continue the very important work that you do in the communities of Santa Barbara, San Luis Obispo, and Ventura. Our goal is to build trauma-informed and resiliency-focused networks of care to improve life outcomes for children, youth, and families throughout the Central Coast. As we launch into this 2024 Bridges to Resilience Conference, we have some aspirations for this day, and so we wanted to share those with you as well. We're going to be diving into systemic barriers to belonging and inclusion that disrupt well-being. Our theme for this conference is hope, inclusion, and well-being. And we know that without really taking an honest look at the barriers and the obstacles to well-being and belonging, we won't achieve those goals. So we're here to transform resiliency practices, to focus on the positive experiences that each of you can bring to the children and families that you serve, to reduce toxic stress and help support healthy outcomes. We want to generate community-led solutions that align with the diversity of identities, challenges, and resources that coexist on the Central Coast. We want to create conditions for positive change through connection, reflection, and shared learning. So that's what we're here for, and we hope you will join us on this journey. Wi-Fi for today, the network is Resilience, and the access code is Bridges 2024. It's important that you get connected because we're going to have opportunities throughout the day for you to participate in online live surveys, and so if you can connect your phone to the Wi-Fi, that'll make that process easier for us. Also, on the back of your program, there's a QR code that'll take you to the Bridges to Resilience website. So if you need information about our presenters or the sessions that are available to you this morning, the information can be accessed through that QR code. We want to thank our continuing education partners, Cottage Population Center for Population Health, and the Department of Behavioral Wellness. If you signed up for CEUs, hopefully you found your way to the CE table out front, and you've signed in. Just a friendly reminder that in order to receive continuing education credits, you must sign in and sign out of every session that you attend. So please remember to do that. I mentioned our Tri-County production partners, Kids Network of Santa Barbara County, the Center for Family Strengthening in San Luis Obispo, and the Partnership for Safe Families and Communities in Ventura County. We are so happy that you've joined us today. We recognize that this is a lot of time to dedicate, and we can't do it without you. So thank you for being here. We also want to thank our sponsors, and this year, the James S. Bauer Foundation is our platinum supporter. And the Bauer Foundation is about re-envisioning and providing support for positive social and cultural evolution of our world by making grants to partners who share the belief that a healthier world can be fostered through compassionate action and social change. Thank you to the James S. Bauer Foundation. Our gold and silver sponsors this year include the Kids Network, Family Service Agency, the Santa Barbara County Department of Behavioral Wellness, San Luis Obispo County Child and Family Wellness Collaborative, the Coastal Tri-Counties Child Abuse Prevention Coalition, and the Topes Foundation. As we settle into this day, we want to remind you that this is a day for you. And so we are going to be taking a deep dive into some topics that maybe don't get discussed a lot. And so we have built into this day some integration activities to help you if you're feeling activated or upset or in any way uncomfortable with the things that you're hearing or the things that you're learning. We ask you to stay curious, to lean in if you can. There's toys on the table you can fidget with if that helps you get yourself into a more calm state. There's water stations in the back. Please stay hydrated throughout the day. There's lovely patio areas with lots of fresh air. So all these are things that you can do to care for yourself throughout the day. We will have lots of breaks and opportunities for networking, and so we ask you to take advantage of those as well. And with that, it is my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Ingrid Cockhren. She is the CEO and owner of Cockhren Consulting. I first met Ingrid when she was working with the PACES Connections. Many of you know PACES Connection as the online web resource for people who are working on adverse childhood experiences and positive childhood experiences. Ingrid comes to us from Tennessee. And she is going to have a very dynamic presentation. I'm going to let her start because I know she's got a lot of things to talk about. And there's more information about Ingrid's illustrious career in the bios that are on the website. So thank you, Ingrid. So there's your clicker.
Thank you so much for the introduction and the invitation to be here. I am soft-spoken. I don't know why I keynote, but here we are. So if you can't hear me, just signal, let me know to speak louder. We're going to get started. First thing is I want you to test our system. I want to be as interactive as possible, so there will be some polling. And so I want you to use the QR code. I find that's the easiest. But you can also text. And for those of you who are on devices, you can go through a browser. And just as it says, just type the word test so I can see if it's working. I have some coming through. As we go through, I will be asking questions. If you can participate, that's great. If not, it's okay. So if you're having any technical issues, it's fine. It's not mandatory. It's just helpful. So I'll give a little bit of time. Also, Connor, can you get my timer as well? I'll talk all day if you let me. Okay. So for those of you who are coming in and getting settled, feel free to test your device. Don't worry, we will have plenty of opportunities to jump in later. All right, let's go ahead and get started. So, we're talking about the beloved community today. Often when we talk about community building, we tend to not talk about how sacred communities are. And so when we think of the term beloved community, it often brings up MLK, Martin Luther King Jr. The beloved community was one of his cornerstones of the civil rights movement. But he got this from Josiah Ross. He was an American philosopher during the late 1800s, and he believed that community was the closest thing to heaven on earth. So I wanted you guys to think about that. Community being the closest thing to heaven on earth. When we are going through this discussion today, I need to give lots of disclaimers. We're going to be talking about race. I'm going to be showing old images. We're going to talk about history. There are even, distressing pictures in this visual. There are racial slurs in this visual. And so I want you to be clear that this is not meant to offend, but to really do a deep dive into the history of the area, of the state, and to examine what that means for us in the past, the present, and the future. And so we're going to talk about what it means to build the beloved community through collective healing and collective liberation. One thing that I love about coming to California is that I get to play. In other parts of the country, we're not talking about collective liberation. I'm from Tennessee. If you know anything about Tennessee, it is the place where the Ku Klux Klan originates. It is also the state where Martin Luther King was assassinated. So there's a rich history there around racial tension and what it means to reconcile or to not reconcile. And so what is the beloved community? I talked a little bit before about how it really was the cornerstone of MLK's message. It is about collective healing. It is about collective liberation. One of the things that I think is most important is the interdependence. Often when I talk about race, it is one direction. We are talking about how people of color have been negatively impacted by racism and discrimination. We hardly ever talk about how white people have been impacted by racism and discrimination in our history. And so it's important to talk about how we are interdependent, that as we allow certain groups to fall through the cracks, that it impacts all of us negatively. I can give several examples of this. As we let the HIV/AIDS epidemic get out of hand because our country was not concerned about the disparity in this impact on gay men. It then became an epidemic that impacted us all. This is the same case with our inability to address the crack cocaine epidemic that was more so impacting African American communities. And now we are at a loss to address the opioid epidemic as we move forward. As we do not address issues within communities that collectively we deem as less important, it has a negative impact on us all. Also, we often talk about historical trauma, which we're going to dig into. But When we think about historical trauma, we think about disparity, again, and impact on people of color. We often do not think about the historical trauma of being on the side of the oppressor, how negative racist attitudes have negatively impacted us all, and they are also transformed and transferred through generations. And this is a reflection of what we would call scientific colonialism and scientific racism. We spend all of our money and research and attention and time focused on communities of color and the negative impact, and not so much focused on white communities and how racism is being transferred and how they are impacting others. What does that mean? It's a reflection of how we have a blind spot in our society and how we solve problems. We are deficit focused on communities of color, as opposed to being proactive in addressing racist beliefs and values and how they transfer through generations. And so the last is radical love, which I think is the most important. Having a deep, unconditional love for all of humanity. And as we are right on the edge of a huge election, we are at our most polarized. We are lacking in that deep, unconditional love. And so hopefully this is a time where it's become very obvious that we are lacking in that. And what does it mean to mend that? And that's what building the beloved community is. And so, like I said before, this term was brought about by Martin Luther King into the mainstream. He was inspired by Josiah Royce. And Bell Hooks took it a little further. I have read and talked about Bell Hooks for so long, and somehow I missed that she was born about 15 minutes away from my hometown in Hopkinsville, Kentucky. But she has brought the understanding of the beloved community into the mainstream through her work. And so what does this mean in practice? In practice, this means that we facilitate cross-cultural dialogue, that we support community-led initiatives, and that we advocate for equity-focused policies. This is just part one of a discussion that I'm going to have today. In my breakout, we'll do a deeper dive into the community work that will really tackle that equity-focused policy piece. What are the challenges? The challenges, again, should be pretty apparent in the way that we are operating in this country currently. The challenges is, being able to just recognize and acknowledge oppression. People are still on the fence about whether America is a racist country. Obviously, having to have difficult conversations. We'll have a little bit of that today, but I find that, often when we attempt to have real conversations about race, about identity, about the past, it is extremely polarizing, it is extremely triggering. People can get into their bodies very quick, they have a trauma response, and again, it's a reflection that our historical trauma impacts us all, to the point where we are not able to have real conversations to address it. We need to cultivate empathy and compassion. As I said before, as we are right on the edge of the election, we are very clear on how we are lacking in that as a collective. And then the inclusive dialogue, having everyone at the table to discuss the issues. This is popular education, how we can be both learners and also teach others about our experience. When we are devalued based on our demographics, then this is difficult to do. And then lastly, the sustained action. We have plenty of initiatives that pop up and fizzle out. And often those initiatives, I know as in my time with PACES, we have community initiatives that are really excited and passionate about the work, and as soon as they hit up against that DEI wall, then things crumble. And so that sustained effort is crucial to this work, and it is really really depends on, again, confronting those difficult truths. And so when we say collective liberation, what we're talking about is an ongoing process that we liberate ourselves from the structures that we've created, and that we do this through, again, radical love, having those difficult conversations. And so let's jump into it. Racialized history of the state of California. The trauma of one generation becomes the inheritance of the next. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to outline what is collective, historical, and intergenerational trauma. We're going to examine trauma through a social ecological model because we are systems thinkers. We do not stay just at individual trauma. We don't stay just at self-care. We have to see the big picture. We're going to outline how community level, collective and historical trauma impact community well-being, and then we're going to look at how this impacts the Tri-County area specifically. One term that we have to discuss is that we have been historically and are currently really a white supremacist country. This is not opinion, this is encoded within all of our policies. If we go back to our origins, we can see policies that were very explicit of upholding white supremacy for social, for economic, and political gain. We also have to see how this impacts not just policies, but really impacts our collective mental health. When we think about the mental health crisis that we are in today, we have to look at the origins of the field of psychology. I say this as someone who is a psychologist. This is how I got into this work, through the field of psychology, and now I'm anti-pathology. And so we have to understand that our social sciences have been corrupted by scientific colonialism. We have no North Star in this work. As we engage in research and we think about all the different ways that we see disparity and other issues in our research, we have to understand that we are looking at it from the wrong angle. We are looking at people and judging their communities, judging their culture, when we should be looking at the systems that they've been subjected to. And so, yes, any group that has been subjected to slavery, genocide, systematic rape, sexism, is going to have disparity. They're going to struggle academically. They're going to deal with issues of incarceration. The fact that we are even researching this is strange. We should be researching how we have created systems to make this possible. We need to be looking at root cause. And so root cause is right here. The belief that people of color are inferior, that their cultures are inferior, that the food that they eat, that all of their practices are inferior. This is how we got here. And it is embedded within all of our social sciences, not just psychology, education, medicine, all of our social sciences. And so one of the tenets of building beloved community is that we address root cause. So far, we've been addressing symptoms. We talk about educational disparity. We talk about health outcomes. We talk about incarceration, housing issues. And we believe that they are root cause of the problems that we see in our society, and that is not the truth. The root cause is a system that has determined that some groups are worthy and some groups are not, and operates as such. And that's the root cause. And until we address the root cause, then we will always have the symptoms. They will manifest in many different ways. If we were to suddenly wave a magic wand and have no systemic racism, we would still have disparity. And the reason why is because we've had hundreds of years of these racist policies and ideology to the point now where it has changed our DNA. We're more likely to have chronic disease. We're more likely to have disparity because of our past, because of our history, because of our beliefs and values, and how that manifests throughout our society. And so we have to begin to address root cause. How do we change hearts and minds? Is that possible? And so let's talk about some key terms. First is collective trauma. I've been presenting on collective trauma since about 2016. It has gotten much easier to talk about it now, right? People are very interested since 2020. And so do you think that COVID-19 was a collective trauma? I see a lot of yeses. Collective traumas are very unique. They are not like individual trauma. They do not have the same waves and ripples as individual trauma. Collective trauma really impacts how we view ourselves, how we view the world. It impacts our policies. It impacts how we interact with each other. It impacts our communities. It changes our entire way of life. And that's why collective traumas are so unique. And when we think about, collective trauma, we can go back to the science that we already know, which is that we understand that adversity, especially at critical times in our lifespan, have major impact, that they change our brains and bodies, that they impact how we relate to others, how we attach to others. And we know this because of the science behind the Adverse Childhood Experiences study. We also know, as we expand on that research, that discrimination, poverty, and racism, bullying, and other societal issues have impact just as much as those initial 10. So what does that mean when we think about, trauma on a large scale or trauma through generations? We have, this understanding that trauma can transform through generations based on several dynamics. Here, when we look at this visual, we have the arrows on the side of epigenetic mechanisms and also intergenerational transmission. These two key processes mean that the trauma of our ancestors lives in our DNA, but also lives in our parenting, lives in the way that we interact with others. You bring it to work, you have it at home, it is a part of you. And so if we look at race specifically, then we understand that it is closely tied to culture, and it is also closely tied to our identities. We identify with race, we internalize it, it is a part of us. And our understanding of race is really based in the, educational elites in Europe during the 17 and 1800s, where they encoded within textbooks that indigenous peoples and Africans were savages. They also said that at the time they were talking mostly about Chinese people, but they said that they were semi-savages. And they created a racial hierarchy. And they encoded that within textbooks. We still believe in this hierarchy today, no matter how much we don't want to say that we do. When we have implicit bias assessments, still in this country, between 75 to 80% of us have a positive white bias. This means that we have brought this into our beliefs and values based on, again, hundreds of years of impact. And so this has resulted in racial trauma. Racial trauma is when we experience traumatizing events based on our skin color. Those events can be as, I don't want to say minor because microaggressions aren't minor, but they can be microaggressions all the way to racial slurs, all the way to discrimination and physical attacks. Racial trauma is just like any other trauma, with the exception that it is tied to identity. And those direct stressors is what we tend to think about. We think about the racial slur. We think about discrimination at work. But there's also vicarious trauma. And so individuals see George Floyd there, and many people watched the video of his death, and they were traumatized vicariously, even though they were not present. But I will say that people of African descent were even more traumatized by that visual, especially Black men. And that's because race is tied to identity. And so vicarious stressors, when we see others suffer based on race and racial incidents, is as impactful as any other type of vicarious trauma. And then we have transmitted stressors. This means that the trauma of my ancestors, again, based on those epigenetic mechanisms, but also intergenerational transmission, so the way that they parent me, is passed on through generations. For better or worse, survival parenting is not inherently bad. I have to teach my children how to survive in a racist society. Until the society is no longer racist, it's my responsibility to pass along racial information to my children to make sure that they survive. We see this in our understanding of interactions with the police. Certain groups think, oh, you're in trouble, go find a policeman. Other groups say, regardless of how much trouble you're in, do not tell the police. And this is because of our history. And both are valid, meaning the police have been arms of our larger legal system and have encroached upon communities of color and have been used as a weapon. And so therefore, I should tell my children to be wary of the police.
Here you go. That one ran out. Sorry.
Hello? Okay. And so transmitted stressors are insidious in nature. They last through generations. Typical research shows that we're getting to 3 to 5 generations out from a traumatic experience still having impact through generations. And that is in several different studies, including humans, but also rat studies and other different types of studies that show that trauma is transferred through generations in our species, in mammals. And so let's try it again. Let's cross our fingers to the technology gods and see if it works. How has racial trauma impacted you and your community? Not feeling safe. Mass deportations. Culture, identity, and parenting. Hypervigilance. I'm going to give another minute for those responses to come in. I want you to see what others are saying. I see relationship with family. It makes me think about issues of colorism. Even within families, we have hierarchy of skin color, hair texture, eye shape. So please continue to fill that out, but we're going to move on. Thank you so much for sharing. And so those answers are a reflection of what's known as intergenerational transmission of trauma. This means traumatic experiences of our ancestors are passed on through generations and impact us today. And this means that we are really born in spaces of advantage or disadvantage from the start. And so when we think about intergenerational transmission, they often start with either an individual within a family that has a traumatic experience. Let's think back, when I think about my grandmother, I think she had her first child when she was 13. What does that mean for me? How does that impact the way that I'm raised? How does it impact my view of gender, sexuality? How did that impact the way that my father acted as a man? What does that look like within families? That's intergenerational transmission. However, when it happens on a large scale, when we have a collective trauma like slavery, genocide, land theft, displacement, then we have to make collective understanding or collective meaning making. If we think about COVID, and trauma is political, and I don't know everyone's political views in here, but I will say that if I think about COVID at the beginning, our leadership that was in place, as we have a virus coming in, what are the things that we need to do? How do we help people to get on board with, social distancing or washing their hands more or covering their mouths when they cough, things like that. There's a leadership hierarchy that is supposed to help us navigate through that helps us to make collective meaning, that gets us to rally behind the belief that we can overcome a virus through these means and methods, right? That we take it on as a personal responsibility to our collective well-being. Right? Without that, then we fall into our own individual preferences, what makes us comfortable. This is something that adults do for children all the time. We help them through a meaning-making process. A child has a traumatic experience. We help guide them through a meaning-making process by maybe disclosing, I went through this too. And so I was able to overcome. So you can too. This meaning-making process is essential. So what's the meaning-making process for slavery? How do we help people to understand where they are in the world? What their future should be like? It's going to be survival-based. It's going to be keep your head down, be invisible, don't stand out, don't create problems. You are expendable. What's the collective, meaning-making process for the stripping of one's traditions? This is where cultures and parents and communities are when they experience a collective trauma. We have to make up a meaning-making process to help us to get through it. Meaning-making process, when done well, help us to rally behind, help move us to post-traumatic growth, post-traumatic wisdom. When not done well, then we have a difficult psychological legacy. And so when we think about collective trauma, they do not happen within a vacuum. They happen within the social political context of the time. Again, think about COVID. It is a respiratory virus. And yet it became a political football. And we had protests and civil unrest around wearing masks and haircuts. And so what does this mean? It means that the time that we're in also determines our understanding and meaning-making process for collective trauma. When we had slavery and the genocide of indigenous people, it was on the coattails of textbooks that said that these groups were savages, that they had no culture, that they did not have souls. And this is why it became easy to enslave and to kill, to exterminate, to take land. And so this is why it is important to think about what this means for our collective, what this means as to how we should handle future collective traumatic events, instead of falling in upon each other and scapegoating and blame. We have to go through a collective meaning-making process to move us to post-traumatic wisdom, post-traumatic growth. And so when we have these large-scale adverse events, they impact everything. They impact our decision on whether or not we want to have children, whether or not we want to stay in the job that we're in. They impact our beliefs, our values, how we interact with each other. I still don't like to stand close to people since COVID. I'm still trying to create a bubble around myself. And that's because there's residuals from that time period that will stay with me, but also my daughters are watching me. And so they might pick up on, oh, we have to, give me 50 feet. So we have to think about these ripples from these traumatic experiences. They do not stay in the time. They go through generations. And so this is our collective memory, our collective experiences. We hold them together. Now, we might not get the same meaning out of these same experiences, but we hold them together. And they can create what we call angst or an existential crisis. Is anyone feeling angst since 2020? Anyone feeling angst about climate change? Anyone feeling angst about the racial reckoning, not just from 2020 as well? This feeling of, a general state of anxiety based on the awareness of our collective experience is the source of our mental health epidemic that we are having since 2020. It also can be the seed of historical trauma and intergenerational trauma as we move into the future. And so our understanding of intergenerational transmission came about in the 1960s as we studied individuals who had experienced the Holocaust and their children. Our studies since then, again, have found that we are looking at 3 to 5 generations out from historically traumatic experience. They're still being impacted. The mechanisms through which this happens that I found are maladaptive coping strategies. I am a researcher. My background is psychology and child development. And so when I say maladaptive coping strategies, what does that mean? It means all the different ways that we cope that are not health affirming. So it could be drugs and alcohol, but it could also be, distancing, emotional numbing, displaying anger, other ways that, again, that we cope that do not lead to healthier outcomes. Social learning theory. So as adults are engaging in those maladaptive coping strategies, children are watching them. And they're going to pick up those maladaptive coping strategies just through modeling. And this is why we have, and this is another reason why the field of psychology is so murky. If you have a parent with bipolar disorder, you're going to have a child that's going to be diagnosed with bipolar disorder, and they're going to say that it is hereditary. Right? But it could also just be modeling. Because that parent is in the space, that child models those behaviors, those patterns, those rhythms that they are seeing, they're still going to get the diagnosis. And then there's survival-based parenting, which is probably the most impactful. The belief that my environment is not safe and I have to parent accordingly. I have to parent within a racist society. I have to parent within a sexist society. I have to parent within capitalism. I have to parent with community violence. All the different ways that I have to adjust my parenting to my environment that send messages to my child about their worthiness, about how they should move in the world. One of the ways that this often comes up is the comparison I teach at a historically black college in Tennessee, and I'm about to say something that is not politically correct, so disclaimer. We talk about parenting. It's a child development course, and they're mostly black students, and they have very humorous discussions about white parenting, right? And so they'll say, you know, when I see white parents, they're like, stop, little Bobby, don't do that, you know. And then when they see black parents, you know, it's a little bit more physical than that. It's a little bit more aggressive. And so we talk about these differences and why they exist. And because some parents see their environment as less stressful, less dangerous. So they're going to engage in parenting practices that are more hands-off, that are more about guidance. And some parents see their environment as extremely dangerous. And they're going to parent their child in a way that is more physical. And I'm not even talking about just spanking. Let's say you have a child in the yard and they're, you know, looking like they're walking towards the street. One parent's gonna say, hey, come back this way. One parent's gonna go get them, put their hands on them, pull them back, right? That physical parenting is survival-based. It has plenty of implications around brain development, about spanking, and those children see the differences in their world. They are aware that when they go to the store, that little Bobby gets to run around and interact with things and touch things and say hey to other people, and their parent is saying, you stay right here. You don't get to play, you don't get to run, you don't get to interact because you are black or brown. Okay? And so these messages are internalized. They understand I'm different, even if the parent doesn't say, because you are black or brown, you can't X, Y, Z. Sometimes the parents do say it. But even if they don't, they're getting the message. Survival parenting is very impactful. And then lastly, we have genetics, or more specifically, epigenetics. The different ways that our DNA reacts to our environment. And so if we have hostile environments like racism, slavery, genocide, war zones, then we're going to have epigenetic changes. Those epigenetic changes are tied to our mental health, our cognitive abilities, and our physical health. They make it more likely for us to have a mental health disorder. They make it more likely for us to have chronic disease. And this is what the ACEs study really highlighted for us. The physical implications when we have poor environments of toxic stress, abuse, and neglect. We have plenty of evidence at this point that if you experience adversity and stress, especially at very specific times in your early childhood, especially 0 or prenatal to 3, and especially, you know, it comes back around in the teenage years as well. And so as we experience adversity during these times, it has impact. But even as an adult, even if you're not an infant, you can still have allostatic load or epigenetic impact from negative environments. Think about a toxic work environment and how that correlates with poor health outcomes. And so, again, intergenerational transmission really highlights that as we're born into different environments in spaces of advantage or privilege. And we parent the way that we have been parented. So even if I'm no longer in the state like in slavery or even in a dangerous community, I'm still more likely to engage in that parenting style. And this is a space of inequity within our society. This is also a picture of me and my sister, my firstborn. She's 6 now. So let's reflect. have you inherited trauma from your family? What does that look like? Have you inherited trauma from grandma, from your dad, from your mother, from your ancestors that you may not know, through these larger scale impact of slavery and genocide? We see addiction, alcoholism, and mental health coming up often in this space. Just yes, oh yeah. Oh yeah, scarcity trauma is real. And this is really tied to our economic mobility as well. How we see money, how we see abundance. What does it mean for us to thrive in a way, or to take risk, or to pursue our dreams if we have a scarcity mindset because of scarcity trauma from our ancestors, distant and grandmother, mother, grandfather, father, then it's going to impact that. The implications of intergenerational trauma are huge. Again, if we were to deal with systemic racism, if it was to vanish tomorrow, if all those barriers were moved out of the way, we would still have to deal with the mechanisms of intergenerational trauma. We would still have to deal with the healing part of it. Thank you for sharing your answers here. I'm going to move on to the next. And so let's talk about historical trauma. This is intergenerational trauma that starts with a collectively traumatic event like slavery, genocide. Historical trauma is, again, one of the most impactful issues in our society. And it always is generating. If we think about the conflict in Gaza right now, it's always ongoing. As children are, subjected to war, then we start the cycle over again. Or if we think about even here in the States, when we get to very comfortable race relations in the state, and then we have some type of racial incident, then again we start this cycle over again as children are exposed to that again. Historical trauma is really saying that we have a wound that is passed on through generations that has not been healed, that is accompanied by unresolved grief. Biden just recently apologized for the United States' role in boarding school and family separations. There's controversy about that apology. I do not believe apologies are enough, and we'll talk about that as we move forward as well. But again, historically unresolved grief. We are in 2024 and we're saying, hey, our bad. Sorry about that when we did that thing. That is a reflection that we are not addressing this in a real way. That it is either too far out, too far into the future to be addressed, and often not enough. And so these visuals that are peppered throughout, they're very old, so they're not going to look great. This is an Afro-Brazilian woman who is a wet nurse during slavery. These types of ways of being in the past are deeply embedded within our society. They are multi-generational in scope, and they can then be interpreted as culture. So if we think about single parenthood within African American families, and we think about the long process of history of family separation in slavery, of Black men and their very short life expectancy more likely to be incarcerated, more likely to be killed based on community violence, and how that ties to single parenthood. But then let's add another layer about the policies that were put in place in the 1600s that said that enslaved women could not attach paternity to anyone. So that if you raped or impregnated an enslaved woman, you did not have to take care of her child. These are connected. That's from in the past, again in the 1600s, even before we were a country, and we still see the echoes of that today. And so historical trauma is really about oppression. It is tied to settler colonism. It is tied to all the different ways in which we have said, again, certain groups are not people. They do not have souls. They are not enough. That it's okay to encroach upon them, to enslave them, to rape them. And this is, again, one of the largest issues that we're dealing with today. It has resulted in a legacy of emotional and physical disparity. When we look at, historical trauma from the lens of what are the events that have kind of gotten us here, I create this list. I've been adjusting it since 2015, 2016. I always leave someone off. People always want to tell me, well, hey, don't forget about. So this is not an exhaustive list. Right? But these are some of the incidents that are very America-specific and give us a kind of an understanding of what it means when we say historically traumatic events. So we have genocide. In America, that's going to look like the genocide of indigenous people. When I first started to do research, one article that stood out to me was climate scientists were reverse engineering kind of climate patterns. And they found that there was a time period where so many indigenous people were killed off in America that it changed our weather patterns. And I thought that that was startling. It's the wholesale slaughter of indigenous people from the 1400s up until about the 1700s. Then we have chattel slavery. I want to make very clear I say chattel slavery because I want to have the indication that is a type of slavery that is tied to livestock. So people not having names, people being in chains, people not being able to engage in cultural traditions, things of that nature. The belief that slaves did not have souls. This is not the same type of slavery that you may encounter across the world. American slavery was considered chattel slavery, where they viewed people as livestock. Mass incarceration, which is very specific to California, as you are always number one in this space. In disparity around incarceration based on race. Obviously, forced relocation, displacement, 9/11, a more modern, historically traumatic event, Jim Crow. You will also see pandemics there. People often do not talk about colonization and missionization as historical trauma, but they should, and we need to have more research into that. One of the things that stands out for me is the stripping of cultural identity and practices. If we understand that the stripping of cultural identity and practices is a traumatic experience throughout generations, what does it mean to restore that? It would mean that connecting to your indigenous practices in traditional medicine is actually healing. And so when we think about how do we connect to that, it's important to, examine religion in this space, to examine how traditional practices have been demonized, and what that means for people to kind of go back to that. And I was having the discussion, white people have indigenous practices too. And so how do you connect to your indigenous practices as a means of healing? Typically, we think of yoga, meditation, right? But we are not all Asian. So how do you connect to yours, to your traditional practices, to your traditional diets? Because we're also talking about our genetics, right? So that's just something to think about, and we'll talk about further in part 2. Groups most impacted, another controversial list. I often get emails after I present, like, you didn't include. Again, this is not an exhaustive list. When I say most impacted, I am talking through a research lens. So when we look at the research and we're talking about disparity, we're looking at impact to life expectancy, health outcomes, and also social cues like housing and education. I include children and adolescents of all backgrounds because, again, of those vulnerable periods. Prenatal to 6 and teenage years are extremely vulnerable to trauma and traumatic experiences. I also have a little asterisk there with Latino and Muslim Americans. I included that asterisk because despite having so many of the historically traumatic events, there tends to be a great deal of resilience within these two groups based on familial connections and also connections to their traditional practices. They're more likely and have experienced less stripping of their traditional practices than Indigenous and African Americans. And this has led to a buffer or protective factor, which is another way of discussing how important it is to stay connected to your language, to stay connected to your traditional practices and traditional medicines as a means of healing and as a protective factor. And so we all know the symptoms. We live in the symptoms all day long. We are always talking about educational disparity, housing disparity. We live in the symptoms all the time, so we know what they are. One of the symptoms that I think is probably the most impactful is relationship difficulties. Those who have historically traumatic background tend to have the inability or have impact in their ability to maintain and form relationships. And this is not just familial or romantic. This is coworkers. This is in school settings, having friends, getting along with teachers and people in authority. Relationship difficulties is probably by far on this list the most impactful. If we say that resilience lives and thrives in relationships, then that means how trauma impacts our ability to form and maintain relationships. This is the most impactful symptom. It's divorce rates, it's toxic workplaces, it's poor attachment, and it fuels our poor mental health outcomes. And so when we look at California specifically, what contributes to poor race relations, or in other words, what takes away from the beloved community? And you'll see this list here. There have been very clear, distinct patterns that have taken away from the beloved community within the state of California. And you'll get this slide deck as a PDF. So it's time for a reflection. Thank you. What are the mechanisms And so when we look at this screen and we see how prominent maladaptive coping is, drugs, alcohol, emotional numbing, distancing from others, self-harm, suicidality. The RISE Center does a great job. They have a great framework that I'll talk a little bit about in this session, but definitely in part 2, that talks about coping, and they don't use the word maladaptive. They see coping as, this is just as what you have to do to deal with the racist system, or sexist system, or capitalism and poverty. And so as we attempt to cope, if we do so in a way that is not health-affirming, then we are more likely to pass that on to future generations, those who are around us. I'm very interested. Any volunteers who put other, who want to share what their other was? Anybody? Any takers? Oh, go ahead. It was just a little bit of everything. It was all the things, okay. D for all the above. Got it. Okay, thank you so much for engaging in this survey. We can go on to the next. So, communities of color face unique challenges because of historical trauma. It impacts all aspects of life. And so when we look at what that means, we have a very clear equation. Institutional racism, throughout the hundreds of years that we have policies and history of it, plus historical trauma, is what leads to social determinants of health. If we think about all of the different social determinants of health, we will find that race and poverty are the 2 main drivers. And race is the one that's across the board. So even if we have, we will account for income, race across the board is the main driver for social determinants of health. This is an indication that it is not about our physical differences, that there's no genetic differences between the races of people. Race is a social construct. It really does not exist. We've made it up, just like we made up time, money, gender, right? So we've made this up and created environments that then impact us physically. When we look at the Tri-County area specifically, we have a history of racial violence, missionization, which is the stripping of traditional practices, racist propaganda, where they scapegoated immigrants for all the things, right? If you didn't make enough money, it was because an immigrant was taking your money. If you didn't have a job, it's because an immigrant was taking your job. If there was illness, it was because immigrants had brought the illness to the area. So they became scapegoats, and they had propaganda to support that. Commercials, posters, visuals to support that. Obviously, labor issues, xenophobia, white mob violence. We typically do not think of California as a lynching state, but it is. And most of their lynchings were Latino, indigenous, and Chinese. Biochemical warfare, so the testing of chemicals on communities of color, leading to issues of infertility, higher rates of cancer, things of that nature. And then, of course, mass incarceration. And so when we look at kind of the timeline of institutionalized racism in this country, it starts in 1619 because there's lots of policies around slavery. But of course, before that, when it was kind of the settler colonization that was going on, there was no real laws, right? It was just, it was lawless. It was the Wild West, right? So, but we start in 1619 where we have very clear policies with the beginning of slavery. And so let's explore what that looks like. During slavery, when we look at African Americans specifically, this timeline is framed around African Americans, but I will talk about the impact on California. You will see that we have, intense labor. We also have the beginnings of the diagnosis of people based on race. So drapetomania was a psychological disorder that was given to slaves who attempted to escape frequently. So repeat offenders. It was determined that those slaves were mentally ill because slavery was a natural order, and therefore those who were trying to escape slavery were deviant, have deviant behavior. They also had a treatment for it. Anybody want to guess what the treatment for drapetomania might be? Beatings. That was the treatment. And let's think about that when we think about the DSM and what I put up before from the first president of the American Psychological Association. We have to begin to look at environment, not people, when we are thinking about the different ways that we adapt to those environments. And so at this time, this was considered a diagnosis. It was, I believe the man was Dr. Samuel Cartwright. He was a physician because back then they did not have a separation between psychology or mental health and physical health. Also during this time, we have what this time looks like in California. There is slavery in California. California is kind of deemed a free state because it was not involved in the Atlantic slave trade, but there was slavery of indigenous people in California, and we have, missionization was also beginning during this time during the time of slavery. We have, those settlers coming in. They started in the 1500s, and even further than that, the first governor of California came from a slave-owning family in the Midwest. He had ideas about Black people. He, obviously didn't enact slavery. However, he was a proponent of it, and he did not want escaped slaves to come to California. So he prevented Black people in general from coming to California, and he also believed in genocide and land theft of indigenous people. The gold rush obviously exacerbated relations between settlers and indigenous people as well. And also we have missionization, and especially in this area, missionization is really the reason why we have formed cities and settlements. Their roots are in missionization. During this time, we see massacres, especially white mob violence. This was against indigenous people, Latino communities, and like I said before, Peter Burnett was the first governor of California, and he was, aggressively racist. He's well documented in how he felt about indigenous people and Black people. As we end slavery, people tend to think that this was a time or there was a positive time, and it was not. I want to be very clear. As slavery ended, there was a very quick celebration, and then we moved into Reconstruction, and this becomes an era of domestic terrorism against Black people. When slavery was in place, you could not harm slaves without some type of retribution, meaning if you killed a slave, especially if they did not belong to you, you owed the slave owner the cost of that slave. There were laws in place. When slavery ended, these laws did not exist. There was domestic terrorism against Black people, bombing, killing, starvation was rampant, and so there was no change in health outcomes from slavery into Reconstruction. There was more wealth. There was definitely more power as some Black people moved into political positions, But as wealth was accumulated, as political positions were accumulated, it just increased the domestic slavery, the domestic terrorism, to the point where we move into segregation, as people in power believed that it was safer to separate the races because of this explosive violence that happened during this time. And so this overt racism and extreme discrimination was mostly in the southern states, and it also pushed people out of the southern states into the north, east, west, known as the Great Migration. During this time in California, again, when it comes to Black people, there was no slavery. However, there was the Fugitive Slave Act, so people could not seek refuge in California if they were escaped slaves. And people in California who were Black were not able to be paid. So if they were there and working, they were working for housing, but they were not receiving money. Also during this time, race relations were extremely difficult because there was a huge influx of Chinese immigrants to work on railroads and other labor. And this led to, again, a great deal of white mob violence. And so to end this time period, we had several amendments put into place that ended slavery, that guaranteed citizenship for slaves that were here already. And the Civil Rights Act, the first one, impacted not just Black people, but also paved the way for women and Latino communities. And that's the case with the second Civil Rights Amendment as well. And so Jim Crow era, and this is kind of our age of lynching. During this time period, there were many lynchings in California. They're just not as well known. And this is mainly because they were mostly against Latino communities. And so we often don't think of California as a lynching state, but it had one of the highest numbers of lynchings in the country. During this time, the Great Migration, Black people were moving out of the South. California is saying, don't come here. So when we think about, and often when I have talks across the country, one of the things that comes up often in the Midwest and in the West is lower populations of Black people. There's a reason for that. It's not like Black people didn't want to come. They were told not to, and often run away violently. During this time period, we begin our, what we know now as our modern day scientific colonialism when it comes to research as well. Research is beginning to be done on Black people in Latino communities in what we call the social cultural movement in psychology. And this is when they're saying, hey, let's look into the mental well-being of people of color, not from the lens of how are you, dealing with racism, but that you must be different from white communities. So much so that they had 2 research studies that really stood out to me in their foolishness. One was that they found that Black men were more paranoid than their white male counterparts in the 60s. I wonder why Black men would be more paranoid in the 60s than their white male counterparts. This isn't a good example of how flawed our research is and what we choose to look at and what research gets funded. Right? We have no North Star in this space. Our research is all flawed. It's on its head because we are looking at deficits in communities of color as opposed to looking at the implications of racism. This is also when we have studies on survivors of the Holocaust and their children. This is also when we have the doll test. This is when we begin to understand that at age 3 to 5, children are aware of a racial hierarchy. They can look at dolls and say, this doll is nicer, this doll is more intelligent. because they have lighter skin. So this is another indication of how we internalize identity as early as age 3. One thing about this time period is this is the first time we have an increase in life expectancy for African Americans. We often, again, don't see California as a lynching state. This is the lynching of a Mexican woman who is known as Juanita. Mostly, when it comes to lynchings in California, they were mostly indigenous, Latino, and Asian. They included both men and women and children. We had the 1916 typhus outbreak, again, scapegoating. Immigrants were somehow the cause of this outbreak, and the propaganda that went with that. We have the Immigration Act of 1917, again, mass deportations, separation of families. And just like African Americans during this time, labor disputes were rampant and violent. And so people were being killed based on labor disputes if they did not want to work, or if they attempted to organize for more money, then they would be killed during labor disputes. We have the New Deal, we have suburbanization. This is the beginnings of our housing issues. As we move into this space and move into integration, this then leaves people of color less likely to get loans for housing. This is the beginning of our housing discrimination. And it is the beginning of a system of redlining, which is very prominent in California as well. During this time, we also have Japanese internment between 1942 and 1946 in response to World War II. And so this time period is ripe with the understanding that there's a push for the separation of the races, that this push is distinctly about race and no other issue. So regardless of income, the separation of the races, from the higher-ups at the policy standpoint, they believed it had to be done because of that domestic terrorism, that it was so unsafe that they put in laws to separate. But at the end of the day, it definitely made it very clear that we were separate and not equal. And we have widespread community violence in response. One of the things that, the civil rights movement was obviously rife with violence. We also have the Watts race riot in 1965. Most of the race riots in California were due to policing, police brutality. And then we have the end of the Jim Crow era that brings us into the modern era. When we look at the Tri-County area specifically, we have, some historical context as we have, immigration policies, as we have migrant workers come in, and there is very distinct, poor conditions for them. We have mass deportation. In the 50s, in the 60s, we begin, again, with that labor organizing, which definitely brought about more economic stability for migrants and Latino community in general, and for African Americans, but it was not easy. It was hard fought, and again, it was violent. And then we are integrated. And we move directly into mass incarceration. As we integrate our population, the first thing that happens is mass incarceration. This is an example of our legal system being used as a weapon. So now that we have laws in place where we are not allowed to separate the races, and we are now allowed to intermingle, go to the same restaurants, go to the same stores, there is a huge uptick in arrest for minor offenses, for being Black or brown, basically. This uptick was just as impactful as the uptick of mass incarceration at the end of slavery. People tend to think of mass incarceration as a more modern issue, but when slavery ended, there was mass incarceration at that point as well. During this time period, we have the first dip in life expectancy for Black and brown people. As we move out of slavery, there was a steady increase in life expectancy and healthy outcomes. But during the war on drugs and the crack epidemic and the HIV/AIDS epidemic, there was a distinct drop in life expectancy for Black and brown people. The war on drugs mostly impacted African American and Latino communities. And we also have very pivotal times in California with the beating of Rodney King and the murder of LaTosha Harlins. This is where we have this kind of turning point where there needs to be a very clear understanding of how important multiracial cooperation and collaboration is. The LA riots, LaTosha Harlins' murder was a catalyst for that, and it was also a sore spot in African American and Asian Americans' relations. And so present day, we still have that disparity. California is one of the most progressive states. I love to come here because of that, because I get to do things like this and talk about things I wouldn't normally be able to talk about, like in Tennessee or like Michigan, right? And so for your progressive ways, you have a lot of rhetoric. You say the right things, and yet we still have disparity. And so what does it mean to address it in a real way? It is those continued hard conversations. You have innovative policy, but racism will definitely thwart the implementation of any policy at any given time. And so present day, with the disparity still there, we have very clear disparity in economic and educational progress. We have very clear disparity in incarceration, and the most dramatic is housing. California still ranks high. I think you're number one in racial disparity in incarceration out of all of the American states. And that disparity is especially for African Americans because of the small population that you have, and Latino communities. As you can see, this is a statewide issue. It's not just one area. You have incarceration issues across the board, across the state. When it comes to historical trauma in California, most impacted still Indigenous, Latino, African American communities. And so I listed many historically traumatic events. Which ones do you feel that still connect and still impact you and your family today? I really appreciate assimilation. I think it's something that's extremely relevant for the Latino community as well. There's so many advantages to assimilate in this country. And people often do not talk about the trade-off in assimilation. And it is historically traumatizing to let go of one's language, one's traditions, as a trade-off to be more economically stable or more accepted in the society. So I appreciate assimilation being on the list. Thank you for engaging in that poll. We're going to keep going so that we can touch on healing before we close out the keynote. Healing is the most important aspect of this. What I've done is kind of laid out the big picture and how we got here and what that really looks like. When we talk about healing, we already have kind of the layout for trauma-informed practices. We always leave off number 6. Are you going to a lot of trauma-informed trainings where they're really doing a deep dive into cultural, historical, and gender issues? The Rise Center out of Richmond does a great job of outlining what healing looks like. On one side, we have kind of the distress and dehumanization, nation building, systemic subjugation, atmospheric distress, and the embodiment and expression of individual level distress. And on the other, we have what healing can look like. Collective liberation, leading with love and justice, build a beloved community, honor resilience and fortitude. And so we spend a lot of time at the individual space. We talk a lot about self-care. We talk a lot about individual traumatic experiences. And there's nothing wrong with that. But it is a part of a larger system. That individual space is very relevant. It's in your faces all the time. Hopefully you know what coping skills, what you can engage in and things of that nature. But when we get outside of that, it becomes harder. What does it mean to have community healing? What does it mean to have policies that promote healing? What does it mean to address our history and to transform our beliefs and values? This is, what ultimate collective healing has to, it has to have all these components. It's not just the individual. It sounds great that you can, get your nails done or get a massage or do yoga or meditation at the individual level. There's lots of different ways that you can engage in healing. How does that impact your community? How do we have institutions that can promote healing? What does it mean for you to change your beliefs and values to promote healing? These things are very difficult, especially the beliefs and values. And so one of the ways that we can think about healing is to really, lean in to our ancestral wisdom. One of the ways that we know that we don't have this is that, we've been a species for quite some time, right? Homo sapiens have been around for a while. Why are we still wondering how we should parent? Why are we still trying to figure out the best diet? How do we not know how our planet works? The reason why is because we have been separated from our traditional ways of being. Indigenous practices, you had, process for every aspect of being. How you should hook up, who you should hook up with, what you should eat, when you should eat. All of these things have been stripped away by colonization. Colonization came along and said, don't eat whenever you get hungry. You eat breakfast at this time, you eat lunch at this time, you eat dinner at this time, and this is what you should eat for breakfast, and this is what you should eat for lunch, and this is what you should eat for dinner. And the reason why is because it is all based on the capitalist system, the structure that's needed to increase profits, to make money. It's not based on ancestral wisdom. We have stripped that away to go wholesale into productivity. And so ancestral wisdom is how we reverse engineer, how we get out. We engage in a holistic approach. We see ourselves not just as individuals, but as part of the larger collective. If anything, COVID taught us that. Right? COVID made it very clear that we are disconnected from the collective. If you have people having whole tantrums about a haircut in the middle of a pandemic, it's a reflection of how far we have come from this type of way of being. Integrating spirituality. This is controversial. Anything that deals with religion is controversial. One of the reasons why I'm in this work is because I wanted to connect to my own history, my own background. As someone who is a descendant of slavery, I have no idea, who my people are, where they come from. I go through that process, and then I meet resistance from my own family. And it's because, they're Baptists. And so traditional African beliefs are considered the devil to them. And that's because we've demonized certain groups based on their practices. How can I connect back to my indigenous way of being if it's considered to be the devil? And this is how we have, we need to embrace and integrate spirituality, not just one type, not just Asian. We're not all Asian. Meditation and yoga are great. I'm not trying to be funny. I'm saying that we need to think through what is us? Who are we? How do we connect to our own indigenous practices? How do we find our background? How do we find who our people are? And embrace that and integrate it into what you already know. Because there's a middle ground. Right? I'm not saying that all indigenous practices were wonderful. Right? We're not going to get into animal sacrifice, right? So what I'm saying is we integrate. We understand our background. We integrate into what we know now. We don't see that part of ourselves as damaged or deficient. We see all of ourselves, and that is what integrating spirituality is. And so I want to give space for any questions before we move into our next segment. And thank you for your time and attention today. Are there any questions? And again, I have a part 2 for the breakout, but if there are any questions that I can answer for you in any space, now is the time. Yes?
Curious what part 2 will dive into. I'm interested in the sort of parenting process and survival-based parenting and maladaptive coping strategies, whether there are reading recommendations, your textbook for your parenting class, or that'll be a deep dive in your later session.
Yeah, the later session is going to be community level. So it won't talk specifically about parenting. It will be what does it mean to engage in that building beloved community process at the community level, what's needed. And it's going to be more of a draw on the audience to kind of like what can you bring to the table based on your experience. I am writing a book currently on intergenerational and historical trauma. And people have asked for me to write about parenting, but what I have done, I'm a Harvard Education Press author, and I just wrote a book with a group of people on trauma-informed education. So that is coming out. I'll make sure that I include that in my resources. And maybe I should write about parenting. But no, that's not going to be in part 2. Part 2 is going to be community focused. But thanks for that question.
Somebody way over here.
Oh, she's running.
Hi. I was curious, what are your thoughts about social media and how that impacts, collective trauma and things like that?
Social media is, I guess when we're talking about children especially, is very well documented as having a negative impact on children, especially adolescent girls. It is kind of a hive mind. It is a reflection of our connectedness, but unfortunately, it has led to definitely exacerbated our mental health issues within our society. It has, and one of the reasons is because of parenting. As we parent with the phone in our hands, we are less connected with our children, and it has definitely impacted our attachment. And so I would see social media as not as a collective trauma, but definitely as a collective catalyst to exacerbating our poor mental health outcomes, and a reflection of how our society is not in the space to put people over profit. Thank you for that question. So thank you for your time. I hope that you can come to part 2 in the breakout. I will also make sure that everyone gets these slides in PDF form. And I want to, feel free to follow me, connect with me. I am in Nashville, Tennessee. I'm not local. I'm not in California. But I travel out here a lot. And I appreciate your time and focus in participating. And we are going to... Up next, we're going to have Ismail Hirota. I hope I said that right. And he's going to engage in the movement practice known as Olenchi. Thank you guys so much.